Okay. I imagine the event has started. Okay. Welcome to Aprendendo ao Vivo for today's event. This online conference is a collaborative event of many associations, among which the linguistic. Oh, 1 second. The Asociación de Lingüística y Filología de América Latina, Sociedad Argentina de Estudios Lingüísticos, Sociedad Española de Lingüística, the Linguistic Society of America, the Linguistic Society of Great Britain, Australian Linguistic Society, the British Association of Applied Linguistics, and the Comité International Permanent de Linguistes. For today's talk, first, introducing myself, I am Alexander Kobina from the University of São Paulo, Professor for African Linguistics, and I'm very happy to present for you today Antonella Sorace from the, she's Professor of Developmental Linguistics at Edinburgh University and Director of the Research Center Bilingualism Matters. She will talk about this to you after her talk. She has published very extensively on bilingualism, psycholinguistics, syntax, language acquisition, cognition, and many other things. So please feel free to note any questions in the chat. We will hand them to Antonella after the talk. The title of the talk is The Native Monolingual Standard in Language Research and Why This is a Problem. So I give over to Antonella.
Can you hear me? Yes. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this very, very nice series. I'm delighted to be here. And I should say good morning to you, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. It's afternoon here in Scotland, but I know it's morning in Brazil. So today I'm going to talk about a topic that is very, very close to my heart because I've been approaching it from different angles. And this is the question of the native monolingual standard in language research. And I'm going to show you why it's a problem from different points of view. So these are rhetorical questions that I'm going to put out at the beginning. Are native monolinguals all the same? And are native monolinguals the same for life? So do they ever change? And the most provocative question, are native monolinguals still there? Or maybe can we say they are on the verge of extinction? I know these are provocative questions, and I know that, you know, the obvious answer is, oh, no, of course they're not the same. No, of course they're not the same for life. And of course they're still there. But I hope I'll get the message across that in our practices as linguists or as people working on bilingualism and language learning and language acquisition, we often behave as if the answers for these questions were, yes, they're all the same, they are the same for life. And basically that's the most important point of reference. In fact, I'm an experimental linguist, and most of my research is on bilingualism and language learning over the lifespan. But I think it's fair to say that in most of our research, what we do, if we do experimental research, we compare monolinguals with bilinguals, and we compare native speakers to non-native speakers. So monolingual versus bilingual comparisons, native versus non-native comparisons. And in many of our experimental studies, particularly with certain kinds of statistical analysis, we have to assume that we're comparing two homogeneous groups. So a homogeneous group of monolingual speakers versus a homogeneous group of bilingual speakers. Similarly, a homogeneous group of native speakers versus a homogeneous group of non-native speakers. Now, and we base our conclusions on these comparisons. Why is this, where does it come from? Well, this is not a new discussion, and I'm not pretending that I'm opening up, a completely, virgin territory for discussion, because in fact, this has been discussed quite extensively in certain areas of linguistics, sociolinguistics, and others. So, but let's go over this for a moment, because as I said, I think that in many cases we may consciously, know that this is not the case, but in practice we continue to make these comparisons. So, where does the native monolingual norm come from? Well, let's be aware of the fact that in linguistics, most linguistic research, at least in the last half century, has been conducted in predominantly monolingual Western countries. Many of these countries are in the so-called Anglosphere, right? So monolingual countries where, which are wealthy enough to have research labs, money for research, rich universities, and so on. So the native monolingual, partly comes from there. I'm not saying that the whole of linguistics relies on that, but certainly many areas of linguistics rely on that. So the native monolingual, and the assumption that once you are a native speaker, and monolingual speakers are by definition native in the vast majority of cases, you are the same for life. So you acquire your native language from birth, you acquire one language, and you become a native speaker, and you don't change. Just to give you an example, this is a field that I've recently dealt with in my public engagement work. This is the field of simultaneous translators. In the field of simultaneous translators, the standard practice is that what they call the mother tongue principle. So translators translate into their mother tongue, because the assumption is that that's the best translator. That's what they're best at. And that's what, they're native speakers of the language. And therefore, even if they know the second language very well, translation into the mother tongue is better. And this seems to, again, assume that native is really forever and never changes. In linguistics, again, not in all areas of linguistics, but in many areas of linguistics, for a long time, the main kind of data were acceptability judgments. They are still acceptability judgments, although there has been a debate in the last 20 years that I've contributed to about how to collect acceptability judgments in a reliable way. But basically, the standard, the old-fashioned and the standard way of collecting acceptability judgments, what are acceptability judgments? They are consciously reported perception of acceptability, usually categorical, right or wrong, good or bad, by educated native monolingual speakers who can read, who can judge, quite complex sentences and constructions that are not likely to have been heard before in real life. So that is what, many linguists, and I put myself in that category as well, that's what many linguists have been relying on for a long time. We know now that there are better ways of collecting acceptability judgments. I myself have contributed to the discussion of gradients in natural languages and ways of capturing gradients from an experimental point of view. But again, my contributions also, in a sense, rely on the educated native speakers, not necessarily native, but educated native speakers. So the empirical basis of linguistics, relies on the native monolingual norm. When it comes to non-native speakers, the whole field of second language acquisition was born as a comparison with the native norm. So the native monolingual norm is the target for a second language learner. So, and you know, the target is possibly speak like a native speaker, sound like a native speaker of that language, which may turn out to be difficult or impossible, and there are lots of studies about that. And if you look at classifications of levels of proficiency for non-native speakers, you often see that the highest level of proficiency that can be reached in second language acquisition is called near native. I'm as guilty as anybody else. I've also used this terminology, so I'm not blaming people because I'm as I said, I contributed to this as well. But if you think about what near native means very close to the target, to this nativeness target, but not quite there. So you can't really reach this, this target, but you get very, very close to it. So the native monolingual norm, again, is the point of reference for second language learners. When it comes to research on bilingualism more broadly, and not only within linguistics, but also within psychology, cognitive science, there has been a lot of research on the effects of bilingualism on language and on general cognition. So how are these effects defined? They're usually defined as advantages or disadvantages. So we hear about the bilingual advantage. I'll come back to this. But notice that advantages and disadvantages are always defined with respect to a monolingual norm. So a bilingual advantage with respect to the native monolingual norm, a bilingual disadvantage also with respect to the native monolingual norm. So that is, again, the point of reference that is used in much research in this area. And so underlyingly, bilingual is at least implicitly seen as the sum of two monolingual natives. I know many people before me have said, no, and bilingual is not the sum of two monolinguals. But if you go beyond you know, slogans and definitions, unfortunately, we find that this is a principle applied in real life, outside the domains of research, outside the domain of linguistics or bilingualism or psychology, because in real life, we know that very often bilinguals are judged, they are evaluated, they are diagnosed with respect to standards, tests, for example, or diagnostic instruments that are built on native monolingual norms. So again, you know, either implicitly or explicitly, bilingual is seen, you know, a bilingual is expected to behave like a monolingual in language A or a monolingual in language B. So why is this a problem? So let's start from, you know, discussing why this is a problem. So this is a problem because the question is not whether you're bilingual or not bilingual. So it's not a black or white dimension. So how bilingual are you? It doesn't involve a categorical, a binary variable. In fact, it involves a range of non-binary, non-categorical variables, which lend themselves as being evaluated along a continuum, and I'll come back to this, a continuum ranging from being less bilingual to being more bilingual. So bilingualism, we know that bilingualism is not an either or dimension. Can we give some examples of this? Yes, let's talk about these effects of bilingualism that sometimes go under the name of bilingual advantage. And I would prefer to call them effects rather than advantages, partly because, yeah, advantage makes it obvious that we are using the monolingual a native monolingual as the norm. But we know that there is a range of effects of bilingualism that have been well studied in research. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I'm going to summarize them for you. In language, so effects of bilingualism on language, so an enhanced metalinguistic awareness or a boost to metalinguistic awareness in children, for example, who hear two languages, an inroad into some aspects of literacy, for example, again in bilingual children, not all aspects of literacy, but some are enhanced by bilingualism. If one is bilingual, learning languages, a third or a fourth language becomes easier. So these are just some effects on language. Beyond language, there are very well known and discussed effects on general cognitive aspects. So for example, a better awareness that other people can have a different perspective from one's own. So awareness that it is possible to have another point of view compared to one's own. And this comes from an early perception by children that not everybody is bilingual, and it's necessary to choose the right kind of language depending on who they talk to. And so that means stepping out of one's own perspective and embracing another person's perspective. And this is extended more generally outside the language domain. The domain of focused attention and the control of attention and the ability to handle conflicts is a well-studied area of research. So being bilingual has been found to be associated, being bilingual in a broad sense, again, not just bilingual from birth, but also being able to handle more than one language has been associated with a better control of focused attention and a better ability to ignore distracting or irrelevant information. So dealing with conflict in a general sense, and cognitive flexibility in task switching, for example, and a better adaptability to changing circumstances. I'll come back to this when I talk about language in particular. So these are well-discussed effects of bilingualism. Some of these effects have been associated with the fact that we know that in a bilingual, again, bilingual in a broad sense, languages are simultaneously active. And so bilinguals, when they speak one language, they have to exclude the language or languages that they're not using. So in my case, I'm speaking English to you. My Italian is very active in my brain, and my brain is working to excluding Italian so that and the other languages I know, so that they don't interfere with my English. And again, this practice that is rooted in the control of languages is arguably extended outside the language domain and leads to a better ability to handle and monitor conflicting information. Now, these effects have been found at the center of a big controversy. Some of these effects are, I'm not going to go into this controversy, but people are working on, researchers are working on a better definition of these effects and what they entail and how they can be measured. And that implies, for example, looking outside, the ability to inhibit information, which is what the first focus was. So, for example, now there is some shift of attention in cognitive research towards not only the ability to inhibit, but the ability to disengage inhibition. So the ability to refocus the attention in an effective way. And this is just one illustration. If I know that I have to remember the word kite and ignore the word anchor, right? And then I see trumpet and I have to name what I see as fast as I can. There's no problem about that, right? Because trumpet is not what I was supposed to ignore. But again, if I have to remember kite and ignore trumpet, and I'm ignoring trumpet and I'm focusing on kite, but then I have to say trumpet because I've been ignoring it and inhibiting it. Recovering and refocusing attention on trumpet is going to be slower. So people are slowed down. There is a whole range of studies going on that. The point that I want to make is that there are many different reasons why these effects are not found that go beyond a redefinition of what inhibition or disengagement from inhibition or the actual components of cognitive control are. And I'm going to give you an example about minority languages. Minority languages is an area in which I've done quite a lot of work, is an area that is dear to me because as a linguist, I care a lot about linguistic diversity. And many of these languages survive in a situation of bilingualism. So if we want to preserve linguistic diversity, we have to encourage bilingualism in these languages. And if we look at the effects that I've just mentioned on general cognition in minority languages, we find that they are not always found. Again, there is no consistency there. So just to give you, a short and probably incomplete list. If we look at Sardinian Italian, the effects have been found. Gallic English, the effects have been found. Frisian Dutch, the effects have been partly found, but not completely. Welsh English, the effects have not been found. Cypriot Greek and Greek, the effects have been found. Catalan Spanish, the effects have been found. Basque Spanish, the effects have not been found. So again, we're not talking about exactly the same measurements, but we're talking about a focus on similar effects, from being bilingual on general cognition. So why do we find this variation? We find this variation because bilingualism is not a black or white variable, because bilingualism depends on a range of variables. For example, patterns of bilingual use in these minority language communities. As we know, there are dual language contexts, so contexts in which the languages are heard in a variety of environments and they're not divided neatly in environments where one language is used and environments where the other language is used. So if we take this variable into account, environments and whether there is a diglossic Hello.
Hello, welcome back.
Very sorry about this. I realized I was cut off, and anyway, can we?
Do you know where you were?
I'm not sure where. I probably.
Let me see what the last slide was.
Patterns of bilingual use.
Yes, I think the slide with the simultaneous translators.
Yes. Oh, that one? No. I mean, I'm sure that was one of the very first.
Oh, yes. No, it went further. Wait.
I think the patterns of bilingual use in minority languages that I was talking about.
Yes. Yep, that was it.
Shall I
Between
start?
Welsh, Basque, and Catalan.
Yeah, shall I start from there?
I'd say yes. Where's Miguel?
I'm not sure if I can start from that one. Miguel?
Hello, Antonella, you can start like a few slides before we went offline.
Oh yeah. So, and I'm not sure when it went offline, you see.
Oh, okay. Let me check that.
Yes. Sorry about this. It
was in patterns of bilingual use.
Yes.
That was the slide.
Yeah. Patterns of bilingual use. Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, so shall I share the screen now?
Yes, please.
Okay, should I apologize for this? I mean, I don't know whether people are still there or.
Yeah, there are many people waiting for you.
Yeah, okay. Shall I start now?
Yes, please.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thanks for your patience. Sometimes internet connections are not perfect, and this time they let me down and they let you down. So thanks very much for your patience and for being there. So I was saying, I was talking about bilingualism and the fact that it's not a binary dimension. There are many different factors that can affect bilingualism, and many of these factors affect, for example, whether we see beneficial effects of bilingualism in particular context. I was talking about minority languages, and I showed that in various studies on indigenous minority languages, some of them show these benefits of bilingualism, advantages of bilingualism, others don't. Why is that? One possibility would be because of the patterns of use, whether the languages are spoken in all contexts, or whether the languages are rigidly divided in a diglossic way between context A, where only this language is spoken, and context B, where only the other language is spoken. But again, we don't see that. We see that there are more languages in diglossic context, so single language context, that show these effects than languages in dual language context, but not univocally and not very consistently. And we know that a very famous and well-founded model by Abutalebi and Green actually suggests that in dual language contexts, there is less inhibition and more switching, because both languages are used in all contexts. So there isn't much of a need to inhibit one of the languages, because people have to be ready to switch from one language to the other. On the other hand, in single language context, for example, Sardinia, because you speak only Sardinian at home and you speak Italian outside the home, then there is more inhibition to keep the unwanted language out of the way, and less switching. So the type of bilingual experience, for example, needs to be considered, and that differentiates the bilingual continuum. The variable that we don't fully understand is the effects of language distance. So among the minority languages that I mentioned, there are similar, typologically similar languages, such as Catalan Spanish, Sardinian Italian, Cypriot Greek and Greek, Frisian Dutch. But again, we don't see consistency. The effects are generally found, but not completely. For dissimilar languages, so Welsh English, Basque Spanish, Gallic English, sometimes the effects are found, sometimes the effects are not found. This is another variable that is not completely understood, and we have to do more research on how this variable may affect the possibility of seeing effects, because it's also possible that if the languages are very similar, there's also not much need. I mean, everybody is likely to understand both languages, and so the need to inhibit one of them, regardless of whether it's a dual language context or a single language context, is not so great. So the two variables probably interact in very interesting ways that are not very well understood. So there is a range of modulating factors in bilingualism: language distance, as we've just said, exposure to variation. So how many speakers is a child, for example, acquiring those languages exposed to? We know that exposure to normal variation, so people who naturally speak in different ways, is very important from the point of view of acquisition. If you think of, acquisition of any language, particularly in a dominant language context or in a monolingual context, a child hears the language from many different kinds of people: adults, children, males, females, different registers, different varieties, different pronunciations, older versus younger people, and so on. In a minority language, that variation is often not present. The presence of literacy, whether a person is biliterate, for example, if there is literacy or a writing system in a minority language, which is not always the case, that is important too. The degree of code switching, as we saw before, and attitudes are also incredibly important and usually underestimated in our kind of research. And in this respect, I'd like to mention a project that we recently conducted in Edinburgh. This is an interdisciplinary project, a collaboration between linguists, psychologists, and sociologists. And we wanted to really explore the attitudes that children have with respect to their own bilingualism and their own languages. And we looked at both heritage languages, so Gaelic English bilingualism in Scotland, and community languages, so languages introduced by migration, so children who are bilingual in a language introduced by migration, as well as English or others. And we wanted to really look at the relationship between language and identity and understand how and whether multilingualism is valued and in the child's experience. We don't normally talk to children. I mean, very young children, obviously, there are obvious reasons why we don't talk to them, but even older children, we don't really talk to them. We prefer to talk to the parents or to the teachers or to adults Hello?
Hi, Antonella.
I'm connected with my phone now. I mean, because clearly there's a problem with my connection, normal connection. It might be the weather, which is really awful at the moment. You know, it's very, very windy.
No problem. Do you think you'll be able to use your PowerPoint slides there?
Well, I'm now connected with my phone. So,
okay. So
shall we try?
Okay.
Yeah, I was talking about children, right? And yeah. Is that, can I connect
the
again?
last slide was language and identity.
Yes. Okay. Shall I start again? Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Shall I start again?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry for the further interruption. Definitely not under my control. But I was saying about the importance of attitudes and measuring children's attitudes towards their bilingualism. And so in this project that we run in Edinburgh on children, we wanted to focus on the children's experience of bilingualism in particular languages. And we talked to them rather than asking the parents and the teachers. We talked to these older children, and we wanted to see, by using qualitative methods as well as quantitative methods, we wanted to see whether attitudes towards particular languages and being bilingual in particular languages influence linguistic and cognitive results in standardized tests. And so we found that positive attitudes actually matter. So, for example, both Gaelic English bilinguals and children from migrant families, if they had positive attitudes towards their own bilingualism, they were more likely to show cognitive advantages of bilingualism compared to children who didn't have a positive attitude. And once we put them in a situation where they felt comfortable telling us what they thought about their languages and being bilingual, it really emerged that they were not comfortable, they were not happy speaking these languages, and those attitudes do correlate with the performance in these tasks. So, for example, the children who achieved the highest scores on cognitive tests tended to be from Gaelic-speaking families and go to Gaelic medium education schools. So both very supportive and positive environments for the use of Gaelic. Right, now, the second reason why we should give up this native monolingual standard in these monolingual versus bilingual or native versus non-native comparisons is getting really interesting now, because we know that learning a second language has an effect on the first language. So remember, we talked at the beginning, the assumption that once you're a native speaker, you're a native speaker for life. And you can be relied on as a native speaker for life. Now, is that the case? Let's look at the situation. First of all, many more people learn foreign languages. In the European Union, there's more and more people doing that. Even in Great Britain, which is in that ranking order, is among the last, as you can imagine, because of the status of English and the fact that many people feel that they don't really need to learn other languages because everybody speaks English. Despite that, there's more and more people learning foreign languages, certainly in the EU, but also in other parts of the world, including the so-called Anglosphere, so the United States and other countries where English is either the national or the most common language. We also know that people move around. There is a lot of migration to other countries. And so people leave their original communities, move to another community. And so this is the prime context in which in which we can look at what happens to the native language once you leave your original community. Now, this goes under the name of attrition, which is a name, a term that I never liked very much because it suggests loss, it suggests erosion. And certainly those were the aspects of attrition that were originally studied, because they were studied in communities that emigrated very early on, for example, in last century, when emigration meant really cutting off ties with the original country and the original community. But now, you know, we're talking about different kinds of migration and maintaining, there are many different ways of maintaining ties and contacts, and being able to travel, social media, internet, and so on. That means that contacts with the original community are easier. But nevertheless, we study how the first language, the native language, changes as a result of learning another language. Now, when does it start changing? How proficient do you have to be in the second language before your native language starts changing? Well, it depends. You know, we know, for example, that from a lexical point of view, access to the mental lexicon starts being affected very early on. So access to the mental lexicon in your native language becomes slower even after, you know, you don't need to be very proficient in a second language. Your second language lexicon starts developing, and that slows down access to your native lexicon. What about grammar, which is what I've been working on and what really interests me? Let's make it clear that we are talking about here about first generation changes. So changes in the native language of first generation speakers who were born and raised in their original community. So these people are people who were born and raised in their community. Then they moved to the second language community. That meant that they started having much reduced exposure to input and to language variation. Remember, we mentioned it before, but language variation in the native language, because they're not part of that community anymore. Also, they start speaking to other speakers of the same language migrated to the same community. So other L1 native language migrant speakers, and in speaking and in interacting with these speakers, there are processes of alignment, so copying each other, so to speak, priming each other, and so processes of adjustment to each other in these communities. That's first generation, and this is what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about another meaning of attrition or change, so intergenerational changes. So what happens to the next generation? So the children of the speakers that I'm talking about, the first generation speakers. What happens to the second generation speakers, heritage speakers, once they get input from attrited speakers, from these first generation speakers? At that point, we know that children regularize inconsistent input if they hear enough of it. And at that point, the grammar starts changing. And that is one of the reasons why languages change diachronically in the process of intergenerational transmission. I'm not talking about this today. I'm just talking about what happens in first generation speakers who have completely acquired their native language and then they move to another language community. So what we see here is something very interesting. We see that these native speakers, so in their native language, they start behaving like advanced second language speakers. Now, this seems like, you know, some people react to this by saying, oh, really? So they're losing it, right? It's not really loss that I'm talking about. I hope this will become clear. But it is something that we see is a kind of convergence that we see in studies of attrition in the native language in these speakers and studies of advanced second language acquisition by non-native speakers. the convergence that we see is in language structures, in particular language structures. So not the whole of the grammar, not the grammar in its entirety, but only language structures that require a rapid integration of contextual variables or pragmatic variables. For example, the use of pronouns that we've studied extensively. So, for example, the way native Italian changes in a speaker like myself, so first generation speaker, born and raised in Italy, moved to an English-speaking environment. So, as you know, Italian has a choice of overt and null pronouns that is not random, but it's governed by pragmatic and contextual considerations. So if you see a sentence like this, Paula greeted her mother when null went out, so null pronoun went out, who went out? If the pronoun is null, the preferred interpretation is that the null pronoun refers to the subject of the main clause. So Paula, not her mother. Although that interpretation is not completely out. We're talking about preferences. We're not talking about categorical choices here. So that's the normal interpretation, the preferred interpretation in speakers in Italy, right? So it's understood that Paula went out by both bilinguals and monolinguals. With the overt pronoun, it's a bit different, because when an overt pronoun, so quando lei è uscita in the same sentence, when she overt went out, then the bilinguals, so a native speaker outside their community, can accept that overt pronoun as referring to the subject. Whereas a native speaker in Italy would prefer the interpretation where the overt pronoun refers to her mother, so to the known subject. So the normal division of labor between overt and null in a speaker in their original community is that the null tends to prefer the subject or the topical antecedent. The overt tends to prefer the non-subject in this case, or the less topical antecedent. As a result of migration and exposure to a second language, the interpretation of the overt pronoun starts becoming broader. And so the interpretation of the overt pronoun is extended. So it can still refer to the non-subject, but it can also refer to the subject. And this is something that we've noticed in many studies, both of native Italians under attrition, so emigrated in other communities, but also in studies of non-native speakers of Italian who reached a good level of proficiency. And this was what I meant by convergence. So they tend to do the same thing. So the null pronoun is still the same in interpretation and in production, but the overt pronoun is extended. The scope of the overt pronoun is extended. We also know that these changes in native speakers of Italian in these situations are not permanent, because they are vulnerable to, they are open to the effects of re-exposure. So these changes can be partly reversible if these speakers are re-immersed in the original native community. So these are not, we're not talking about really changes in the grammar. So again, you know, it's not loss, it's not erosion of the grammar. There's something else going on here that I'm going to talk about a little bit. So, so what changes in these first generation speakers as a result of exposure and learning another language? One normal interpretation, common interpretation, is that there is another language, obviously, and that language has an effect on the first language. And that is the most common interpretation. So, so if a speaker moves, an Italian speaker, say, moves to an English-speaking environment, then, you know, they're exposed to English, a language that doesn't have a choice of null and overt pronouns. Normally, the overt pronoun is used in the majority of contexts, although this is an oversimplification. And so that's why they start overextending the scope of the overt subject. However, we know that these phenomena are also found in bilingual speakers of two similar null subject languages. So, for example, Spanish speakers of Italian, or I don't know, Italian speakers of Greek. So native languages that operate the same kind of constraints on the choice, the same kind of system, pronominal system, and the same kind of conditions. So there is another explanation for these changes that doesn't have to do with having a particular second language that affects the first, but rather with the conditions that affect these connections between grammar that makes a choice available, the pronominal choice, and a particular context in which one or the other pronominal forms is appropriate. And this, that's what I mean by integrating contextual and pragmatic information. So in order to use a pronominal form or interpret a pronominal form appropriately, you have to take into account these contextual and pragmatic considerations. For example, how much shared knowledge there is between you and your interlocutor, whether what you're referring to is equally accessible and salient to both you and your interlocutor. So according to this kind of interpretation, it's really these interface conditions between grammar and context, to use a broad term, that are changing as a result of exposure to another language. So this is the L1 change that we're talking about. It doesn't mean that one cause excludes the other. Both causes, so both a particular second language, but also general considerations having to do with connecting grammar and context, can be at play and affect each other. So we are talking about a very trendy way of referring to this is bilingual adaptations. So remember what we said before. So the overt pronoun is extended. The null pronoun continues to be used appropriately, meaning when you're referring to something salient in context. But the overt pronoun sometimes is used to refer to, equally, to refer to something salient in context. So it's not that pronouns start being used randomly by these bilingual speakers. Actually, the overt pronoun is extended over context in which you would expect the null pronoun. So we can say that, bilingual speakers are over explicit in a way that monolingual speakers or native speakers in their original communities are not. So they are over explicit. They overmark rather than undermark. They prefer to be redundant rather than ambiguous, which is what using a null pronoun randomly would entail. And so one way of representing this is that there is a trade-off between simplicity and informativeness in communication. So the simpler you are, the less informative you can be. The more informative you want to be, the less simple, the more complex you tend to be. So the solution that these bilinguals seem to have in place as a result of exposure to another language is a solution that magnifies, that solves that trade-off in the direction of communication efficiency. So being redundant is better than being ambiguous from the point of view of being an effective communicator. So if you're redundant, if you overmark, you're still going to be understood. And whereas if you're ambiguous, you're not really, you run run the risk of not being understood. So this is a way of solving this trade-off between simplicity and informativeness in the direction of communication efficiency. Another interesting factor that needs to be better understood is what kind of cognitive mechanisms might be at play in this kind of solution that I'm talking about, that we see in changes in the use of pronouns, for example. And as I said, what seems to be at play is not so much, well, the effects of one language over the other, they may be there, but also more generally, integration of contextual information. So integration, updating the contextual context. So sometimes bilinguals are good at doing that, sometimes they are not. When they're less efficient, they stick in a pronoun, as I said, going in the direction of being more, more redundant rather than ambiguous. And they don't misuse now pronouns. They just stick in a pronoun. So again, this from a cognitive point of view, but this needs to be explored, can be seen again as a trade-off between applying a lot of inhibition to the language that you don't want to use and integration. So integration and updating can be seen as the other side of the coin from inhibition and inhibitory control. So if you inhibit, you focus on something and you exclude everything else. If you try to integrate, you do exactly the opposite. You pull together different kinds of factors. So arguably, and this is not something I'm making up, in psychology, it's a well-attested phenomenon, the more you inhibit, the better you are at inhibiting, the less good potentially you are at integrating. So there is a trade-off that is not once for all. It depends on many, many different factors. But this is what we could see also in bilinguals. So because they need to inhibit the language not in use, particularly if they are late bilinguals or late acquirers of another language, they become less stable at these integration abilities. When they are less efficient at that, they stick in a pronoun, and so they solve that problem in one direction rather than randomly. This kind of being less able to integrate information might be partly compensated for by another effect of bilingualism that I mentioned before. So this ability to see the other person's perspective. So seeing the other person's perspective might partly compensate for this reduced ability to integrate contextual factors. So integration of contextual factors, for example, entails evaluating the degree of shared knowledge and whether we are converging in our common knowledge of the situation. So on the one hand, you may lose out with respect to integration abilities. On the other hand, you may compensate with enhanced ability to see the other person's point of view. Now, all of this needs to be better studied in research. These are just broad directions for future research. So remember the convergence between changes in the native language and second language speakers. So they tend to do the same thing in these particular areas of grammar. And what if what we call attrition, so the changes in the native language, is really the other side of the same coin of learning another language. So in other words, learning another language might entail some kind of reconfiguration of the cognitive network that tends to affect both linguistic processing and non-linguistic processing in particular ways. And that leads to a convergence between L1 and L2 in that we at the moment, we've only studied it in different groups and in different populations. So a population of people, native speakers in a situation of attrition, so in a second language environment, second language speakers, who study the same language to a very good level. We are beginning to study the same individuals, and whether we see this convergence between L1 and L2 in the same individual speakers. And we know very little about that. That needs to be done. But that again entails that bilinguals are not like monolinguals in either language. So to go back to our original starting point, right? So the fact that comparing monolinguals and bilinguals, so native speakers and non-native speakers, doesn't really make much sense. If the native language changes naturally as a result of learning another language, well, comparing the monolingual comparison really doesn't make sense. Bilinguals are not like monolinguals in either of their languages. And by the way, this is another direction in which we can study, you know, what happens to widely spoken languages. We know that the more widely a language is spoken, in a way, the simpler it becomes. So widely spoken languages are simpler than languages spoken by fewer speakers. This is a very broad picture here. So we know that one of the reasons why widely spoken languages are simpler is that they are learned by non-native speakers. Now we have another puzzle, another piece of the puzzle to understand why, you know, we know that the language changes in native speakers as well, as a result of learning other languages in communities where there are speakers of many other languages. So this is another piece of the puzzle to understand why widely spoken languages might be simpler. And this is the last area that I want to discuss. The native language changes as a result of learning another language. Right, we've seen that. But what about simply being, as I was saying a minute ago, in a multilingual society? So are monolinguals in multilingual societies really monolingual? And this is a fascinating new area of research that is emerging. And what is emerging is that being in a more multilingual environment certainly has effects on the brain of monolingual, so-called monolingual people, but also we are beginning to see on their behavior. We did a study on multilingual classrooms in Scotland, and we wanted to see, you know, how social integration of migrant children could be fostered by doing common language learning activities. So Spanish was the new language that everybody had to learn in classrooms. So both Scottish monolingual children and migrant children from different language backgrounds, but not Hispanic or Spanish-speaking backgrounds. So nobody spoke Spanish. Spanish was a new language. And we had a range of classrooms that we studied, varying with respect to the number of migrant children there. So there were highly multilingual classrooms, so more than 50% of children were migrant children from other language backgrounds, as opposed to more monolingual classrooms, so less, 5% of less multilingual children in the classroom. And we gave both language tests in Spanish, but also in English, and cognitive tests to all children, both Scottish and migrant children. And to cut a long story short, we found that with respect to the Spanish and the cognitive tests, a greater number of multilingual children passed these tests with a higher score compared to the monolinguals, despite the fact that many of these multilingual children were still learning English in an active way, depending on when they had arrived in Scotland. But also we found a very interesting trend that we have to confirm with further research, where the more multilingual the classroom was, the better the monolingual Scottish children in those classrooms actually did in the cognitive tests, compared to the monolingual children in more monolingual classrooms or less multilingual classrooms. So this suggests that, you know, being surrounded by languages that even you don't consciously speak may have an effect. And this is exactly what happened in a recent study by Bison Kroll, where they compared monolingual speakers in California and monolingual speakers in Pennsylvania. The two states are different with respect to the number of languages that you hear. So Southern California in particular has a more multilingual environment compared to central Pennsylvania. So all these speakers, these Americans, said they were monolingual, so they didn't functionally speak any other language, and they all had to learn Finnish. And there were bilingual control groups as well. Finnish is not exactly an easy language, as many of you probably know. And then they were tested on some features of Finnish, for example, vowel harmony, both in behavioral tests and in brain imaging tests. And what came out of this study is that from a behavioral point of view, there wasn't much of a difference between the monolinguals in Pennsylvania and the monolinguals in California. So both they were learning Finnish, you know, to similar extents, but from the brain point of view, the brain gave a very different picture, and the brain of the Californians was much more similar to the brain of the bilinguals compared to the brain of the Pennsylvanians. Now, we don't know, because the study doesn't have long-term data, as to whether these changes in the brain actually lead to better language learning abilities in the longer run. We don't know that, but certainly it seems that passive exposure to multilingualism in a more multilingual society actually predisposes the brain to learning another language. So that means that even passive language exposure in multilingual societies has an effect on so-called monolingualism. And so this is just to round up my presentation, and I'm sorry for the many interruptions, but basically there are consequences, there are wider implications of what I've been saying. So the takeaway messages: language learning and multilingualism in society, but in society generally, can have effects on both monolingualism, what we regard as monolingualism, and nativeness. So concepts that we regard as the reference point for evaluating bilinguals or evaluating non-native speakers. These concepts are not as stable as we thought they were. So these are good reasons not to use either monolingual or native speakers as the point of reference to evaluate bilinguals. And more takeaway messages: languages actually influence each other in bilinguals. This is a normal and predictable process. So the effects go not just from the first language to the second language, but from the second language to the first, and from having more than one language on the first. So the effects are, the native language changes to different extents depending on the type of bilingual experience, and there is a lot we don't understand about the influence of the many factors that affect the bilingual continuum that I mentioned at the beginning. So we shouldn't expect bilinguals or multilinguals to behave like monolinguals in any area of society, and certainly we shouldn't expect to behave them like monolinguals in research, and when we do research in linguistics or on bilingualism. We should compare bilinguals along a continuum, and perhaps we should really talk about less bilingual versus more bilingual rather than bilingual versus monolingual, because monolingualism, as I said, there is much of a reason to keep this concept of monolingualism. More broadly, we should avoid dichotomies, and having grown up with dichotomies in my training as a linguist and so on, I've learned that avoiding dichotomies is really very useful in research. Whatever research we do, you know, it's not just a cognitive versus social, or looking at universals versus looking at variation, or looking only at biological factors versus cultural factors, or looking at what is innate versus learned. We need to look both ways. We need to avoid these rigid dichotomies that in many cases have characterized our language research. And we need more interdisciplinary bridges across different subfields of research on language learning, on bilingualism. We need to talk to one another more. We need to collaborate with people working in different fields, much more than what we've done so far. And we need also to communicate with society. And in this respect, I think that researchers, all of us as researchers, can benefit a lot from collaborating, from communicating research to society, because when we communicate research to society, it's not just them, it's not just society that learns from us. We learn a lot from society. So the learning is mutual and the benefits are mutual. And this is what we've been doing with Bilingualism Matters, that was mentioned right at the beginning. This is our Research and Public Engagement Center in Edinburgh that has a wide international presence. We have 27 branches in 3 continents, including North America, Europe, of course, and Asia. And we try to communicate research on bilingualism in very different sectors of society to people at very different levels of education, in very different professional environments, so that they can make informed decisions based on what we think are facts emerging from research, always to be updated, of course, because research is not forever. It's another thing that it's not forever. We have to constantly update our findings on the basis of new research. But there are many misconceptions about bilingualism. And so we want people to be guided in their decisions, not by misconceptions, but possibly by research. Thank you very much. Hello? Shall I stop sharing the screen? Yes. Hello?
Thank you very much, Antonella, for this amazing talk. I would have a million.
Patience. Thank you for your patience. I'm very sorry about the interruptions. Yeah.
We've had lots of comments, lots of greetings, and I definitely would have a million questions to you, but I will let the other people. I just wanted to mention I've done research on African languages in highly multilingual situations, and I was just constantly thinking how when I asked people naively, "What is your mother tongue?" they just looked at me and said, "What do you want to know?" For them, this does not make sense. You know, they grew up with one thing, they speak something else at home, their mother speaks something else. They say, what do you mean? we don't have mother tongues. So I'm very glad that there's a way to put this into to actually research this and find out what is happening. So let us hear from you about some of the issues that have been raised by the audience. We have a question by Ekaterini Pandula from Athens. She's asking, to tap into the monolingual advantage, how plausible would it be to compare groups of the same language combinations to investigate L1, L2 convergence?
Certainly, this is one of the many aspects of, you know, from which many angles from which we can approach the question. As I said, we still know relatively little about the effects of linguistic distance, typological distance on both on the linguistic aspects of bilingualism, but also on the cognitive aspects of bilingualism. So definitely we need more research on similar versus dissimilar combinations, and see how that factor interacts with many of the other factors.
Okay, thank you very much. Catherine Morales from Puerto Rico is asking, how would you account for different levels of bilingualism in sampling techniques for a quantitative study? If you say that it's not a binary classification, but a spectrum.
Right, that is a very interesting methodological problem that I deal with, with my students, for example, all the time. But we, as researchers in the research community, have been trying to address in different ways. So, for example, there are very detailed questionnaires that you can use with participants in an experiment that allow you to eventually quantify the bilingual experience in particular ways. Now, every time we obviously try to come up with a score that includes many of these variables, we are applying some kind of simplification. I mean, we have to be aware of that, right? But at the same time, we are trying to take into account these various aspects of the bilingual continuum in a way that normally hasn't been taken into account. So we're trying to get away, as I said, from the simple binary bilingual versus monolingual. It's not easy to go in the direction of taking the variables into account. We have to be aware of that. And there is no perfect method now that we can recommend as, use this and that's it, you've solved the problem. But there are people working on this. And as I said, there are some very detailed questionnaires that you can use in combination, for example, with other measurements or interviews and so on, and come up with a gradient, a measure of bilingualism.
And thank you very much. The Psychology of Bilingualism Lab is asking, if inhibitory control is improved by the practice of inhibiting one language while speaking the other, how can attitude influence that?
I wish I had an answer to that. As I said, attitudes is something that, it's not normally considered in quantitative studies on bilingualism. So it's one of the many variables that can have an effect. Exactly what effect, and exactly how it affects, particular cognitive components like inhibitory control. Remember that even within cognitive studies, we are not in a position to know how different aspects of cognition affect each other, right? So we don't know, for example, I mentioned, the connection between inhibitory control and the possible, trade-off effects on integration abilities and perspective taking. These are two separate areas of research that seldom come into contact with one another. And so, we need to understand how these different aspects actually interact with that. Are we there? No, we're not there. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. And when you start considering, aspects like attitude, again, this is something that we know should be taken into account. And once you take it into account, you see that it can actually have an effect. But we have to find, better ways of including it in our analysis. And again, I don't have any perfect method to recommend.
Thank you very much. Do we still have time for more questions?
Glad.
Okay, great. Then let's go. We've got Ottoni Neves who asks, is it likely native monolinguals will have a role in language research as reference to understand the original way of thinking of previous generations?
Well, in certain kinds of societies, yes, we can talk about previous generations, right? I mean, we know that in many other types of societies, there's no previous generation of monolinguals. I mean, bilingualism is multilingualism, as you were saying, right, is the norm, right? So it's interesting that in our types of societies, because of what I was talking about in the beginning, monolingualism is the default rather than being bilingual. But certainly, I mean, we can at some point we might have some historical reasons, I hope, to study, differences, between or across generations, as moving from more towards the monolingual side and towards the bilingual side. We'll see. I hope so.
Let's see. We have. Oh yes. Catherine Morales from Puerto Rico also wants to know, how does the bilingualism spectrum affect the conclusions we draw about the bilingual brain and the stages of language acquisition or learning? Who is the competent L2 speaker?
Who's the competent L2 speaker? Not the one who sounds like a monolingual native speaker, not the one who is identical to a monolingual native speaker, right? And I'm not talking about the distinction between, phonological acquisition and syntactic and lexical acquisition, because all these factors have been studied, separately and so on. But I think that we should adopt different criteria to assess, what it means to acquire a second language successfully. Criteria that don't depend necessarily on being like a monolingual native speaker. I think I think Miguel was saying something that we're running out of time.
Oh, yes. In that case, let me thank you for your talk and also for the answers to the questions. And I will let you address the audience before we close the
Thank
session.
you very much for listening. Any questions there? I mean, I would love to see your questions and to be able to answer your questions and interact with you separately. Please send them by email. I'll be able to see probably the chat after we close. And but thank you very much for your patience and for being with us until now. Thanks.